Thank you for joining us online for this evening's symposium. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's James Field, and I'm based at Cardiff University in Wales. And I'm joined online here by my colleagues, Jonathan Dixon from the University of Sheffield and Ashley Towers, also from the University of Sheffield. And we have James Markey and Pierre-Jean from Vertisi. And we're all here this evening to bring you this Digital Dentistry Online Symposium in partnership with ADEE. And the title is Continuing to Bridge the Clinical Gap. And if we could just move on, Ashley, to the next slide, I want to explain what we're going to cover this evening for you all. I appreciate that some people are still joining us for a few minutes, so hopefully we won't miss people too much whilst I'm just explaining what we're going to cover. I'm going to start in a second just by explaining how we got to where we are now. And then Ashley and Johnny are going to spend some time explaining how they bridge the gap between preclinical skills and treating patients at the University of Sheffield. And then perhaps arguably the most exciting part of this evening is where we're all going to explain a little bit about how we essentially are redefining simulation in terms of what the simulators can now do. Which is particularly exciting. And then I'm going to finish off with a few words about a new resource which ADEE has developed to help in this digital age. So in terms of how we got here, several years ago now, and many of you on the call here on the webinar, I know were involved with these, we had some special interest groups that were about preclinical skills. It was an area of dentistry or dentistry education which very few people shared their practice with. We knew very little about it, and people were very good at it in their own institutions, but we didn't really know what people did across Europe. So the first few groups, we made some inquiries about what people did, and it was quite revealing really to try and understand how people were teaching their clinical skills courses across Europe, and there was quite a lot of disparity. So the first few outputs from our special interest group were looking at trying to align our practice as teachers. And we had some good publications from that. The next step saw us move a little bit towards simulation. And then we actually ended up bringing the two concepts together to try and help us bridge the gap between preclinical training and actively treating patients. So hopefully what you'll see tonight is an example of where that journey has brought us to, an example of how we can foster very good collaborative relationships with industry, and also some thoughts to perhaps take forwards in your own institutions. So I'm going to pass on to Ashley and Johnny now to talk about how they use this technology to bridge the gap at Sheffield. So over to you guys.
Okay, thank you, James, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Ashley Towers, and I'm joined by Jonathan Dixon. And in this first presentation, we'll give an overview of how we use virtual reality at Sheffield. So if your school or institution is thinking of investing in a similar virtual reality suite of your own, you can hopefully learn from our experiences and take some ideas from how we've gone about it. So I'll speak about the people involved and how we've integrated it into our curriculum, and then Jonathan will talk about a couple of the initiatives that we've done. So the people involved in the delivery of your virtual reality suite are going to be key to its success. And you can think about the skill set that those people will need in terms of domains of expertise, so educational, clinical, technical, and research, or in terms of the roles that you will need to fill. But having a team where each member can span ideally at least two of those roles is really useful. So, of course, you need leadership, and for us, that's Professor Martin. There will always be substantial capital expenditure to improve when you are starting out with VR, and without that senior driving force, the project's unlikely to get off the ground. They need to be enthusiastic about the technology, and whilst recognising that it's in its infancy, it's something that has really good potential for the future. And then lastly, they need to have the authority to allocate teaching staff to the suite, because you don't want to buy a room full of simulators and then have them gather dust. With that strong leadership in place, you'll need somebody to take a lead in integrating it into the curriculum. I think one of the worst things you can do is treat virtual reality as a digital phantom head and expect to use it in exactly the same ways that you use traditional simulation. I think you can end up frustrated with the differences and miss out on some of the advantages. So we've got Mrs. Martin, and she's really good at spotting the opportunities and places where VR can add something new and different, and then put together those teaching resources for other tutors. And then finally, there's my role. You will very much need some learning technologist support. At the end of the day, they are computers and they do need the occasional prod. But also having an educational background to help collaborate with the curriculum lead and identify how we can best deploy simulators is really valuable. I also liaise very closely with HRV, so knowing what's on the horizon feature-wise, we can sort of make preemptive moves so that we can integrate those new features as they arrive. And then optionally, a team of engaged researchers and former researchers in the field is really good. I think virtual reality is very much a newish field in dental education, and there's lots of opportunities to do something new and exciting, and quality research in the field is always welcome. So we've integrated virtual reality into the first 3 years of our Bachelor of Dental Surgery programme and the preclinical component of the Diploma in Dental Hygiene and Therapy. And when incorporating the virtual reality into our curriculum, we had some guiding principles. Firstly, we wanted the sessions to be tutor-led. There's a lot of research out there that claims that you don't necessarily need a tutor, but we disagreed with that because there's always a risk of negative reinforcement, and only really with the presence of a tutor can you avoid that. We decided that they should be complementary to phantom head training and not just doing the same thing in a different environment. And then we wanted a real focus on reflective practice. It's a new environment, it's different from traditional simulation, so it can be a sort of safe space where knowledge can be explored and developed, and students can be less afraid of making mistakes because there's always a reset button. For the integration into the curriculum, we sort of broke it into 3 stages: the introduction, the core, and the consolidation. We start with pre-clinical skills in the first year, where we set the scene, introduce the simulators, and then present very basic operative concepts. Early years tend to be quite theory heavy, so a practical session is always welcomed by the students. And at the end of those sessions, we capture a student's first ever go at cutting a cavity. And then in second year, the students return to the virtual reality suite as part of their basic clinical skills, where it's used to reinforce phantom head teaching. And because students have exactly the same tooth and the same tools available, we can ask students to compare their work and engage in discussions around different approaches and difficulties. Then we cap these sessions off by revisiting their first ever preparation, and using their by now deeper knowledge, they can critique their own work and think about how they would address any shortcomings. And then finally, for senior students, we use virtual reality to provide focused tuition and real-life patient cases from 3D intraoral scans as a starting point into wider discussions on these more challenging procedures. So that's just a quick overview of how we've integrated virtual reality so far. And I'll now pass you over to Jonathan to go into some of those in more depth.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan Dixon, and I'm a clinical member of staff at the University of Sheffield, and I lead the operative skills courses in the Phantom Head Lab. And as Ashley's already mentioned, we strongly feel that the use of virtual reality dental simulators in dental education are particularly useful in developing core skills, both from a clinical aspect, but also in developing skills as a lifelong learner. Can you move to the next slide, please, Ashley? And these clinical skills include looking at the operating posture, the selection of dental instruments, establishing a finger rest, and also working in a mirror. We can also manipulate and modify the exercises to improve the student's growth as a self-directed learner, and also ensure that they're employing reflective practice within their clinical work. Next slide, please. So I'm going to describe a couple of the initiatives that we've been lucky enough to employ at the University of Sheffield, and these two are focused on bridging the clinical gap between preclinical skills and real patient care. Next slide, please. The first is an initiative that we ran with our senior students, both fourth and fifth year dental students, that were already seeing patients at this point. And they're really preparing to undertake complex operative skills for perhaps the first or the second time. So this involved inviting students to take part if they were preparing to undertake a complex operative procedure on a patient, such as a crown preparation. And they're invited to take part. Pre-operative photos and consent was obtained from the patients. And essentially we took some photos, and we either took a conventional intraoral impression, or we'd used a digital impression software to take a scan of the upper and lower arches. And then we could convert this into digital files that could be used on the virtual reality dental simulators. And also they can be 3D printed to be used in the preclinical skills laboratory. And these patient-specific models were particularly useful because students tend to learn on rather generic models of sound teeth, and having the exact clinical situation printed and also virtually on the virtual reality dental simulators was particularly useful. And we knew this was important because it's been well reported in the literature that students often feel a lot of stress bridging this preclinical to clinical gap, and also they tend to be quite low on confidence. So we used this, and students had 2 separate simulation sessions before treating their real patient. So first they would come to the virtual reality dental suite and prepare the tooth for a crown in the virtual reality dental simulator. And then at a separate session, we would use the 3D printed models in the clinical skills laboratory for them to again practice that procedure. And anecdotally, we've spoken to the students, and they really felt it made a difference to their confidence and the way that the procedure actually happened on the real patient. On to the next slide, please, Ashley. So yeah, we in this case used a Dentsply intraoral scanner. We then converted it to a STL file that can then be imported into the virtual reality dental simulator, and we also 3D printed it using stereolithography. And then the patient then received the treatment about a week after the simulation sessions. Next slide, please. And the second initiative is going to be described in much greater detail in the second part of this webinar. We've looked at developing educationally focused exercises that work on fundamental core operative skills for our younger students. And we've looked to modify these by incorporating clinically relevant feedback into them. And as you may know, most of the current assessment methods by VR simulators are quantitative, in the way that they may say your preparation is 63% accurate, or they may tell you that you've got 11% of a certain target material still to remove. But we really questioned whether this was useful. And this is then going to lead us on to the next part of the webinar. But we don't really feel that this mirrors the feedback that we give students on clinics or even in the phantom head laboratory. The next slide, please. And finally, just a slight detour. I'm going to quickly describe the impact of COVID-19 and its impact on how we have been using simulation in Sheffield. We know that students are seeing less patients and are therefore carrying out fewer clinical procedures due to the current pandemic. And therefore, we're looking at aspects of quality over quantity and how we can improve the quality of each educational experience. And this for us has meant that we've had to employ more simulation-based operative skills teaching. And this is really useful with the new technology that we have with VR dental simulators, because we have the ability to tailor the exercise to fulfill specific educational goals. So that's also an additional advantage of virtual reality dental simulators that we see in Sheffield. And next slide, please.
Okay. Thank you, Johnny, for that, and Ashley, for that introduction about how we're using VR at Sheffield. What we're going to do now is we're going to move on, and we're all going to chip in at different points here, so you'll have all of us involved. But this is the main part of tonight's webinar. And what we really want to do is to demonstrate to you how we have taken this to the next level in terms of what simulators can do. And you saw before that Jonathan was explaining that largely simulators give quantitative feedback. And we tried to turn the corner here, and I'm sure everyone in the team will at some point explain the complexities of this and the head scratching that went on for quite a long time, including getting stuck in Paris on occasions because of strikes, etc. But we made it. A lot of people said this couldn't be done, so I'm quite excited that we can present this to you tonight. So I'll let, I think is it Ashley that's going to carry on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you again. So yeah, we'll now introduce how we developed this new approach to simulator-based feedback in collaboration with HRV. So we all know how important feedback is for performance. It provides corrections, advice, and encouragement, and it's a key factor in the progression of a student's ability. Now, a phantom head is a partial task trainer. It relies on the expertise of a tutor to provide the feedback. So from the outset, virtual reality simulator designers tried to add automated feedback to reduce or remove the need for tutor supervision. And some authors have gone so far as to describe automated feedback as an indispensable requirement. The most common approach in the literature is target-based feedback, and this is used for both tooth preparation exercises and handpiece control or familiarization exercises, similar to the cube with the cross on that's displayed on the slide. And with this kind of feedback, a target area for removal is identified, and then the student's progress is tracked in terms of the percentage of that target removed or the millimeters cubed of material removed. And then the simulator also tracks any iatrogenic damage or material that's been removed outside of the target area. And these are combined to give an accuracy score, sometimes including the time taken. And the idea behind this is that the scores provide an intrinsic motivation for the students to get the best score that they can. However, in the pursuit of that score, we hit up against some of the limitations. And the first of these is that they don't really provide any insight into the why a student removed some material or produced a cavity of a particular design. Students might be removing material simply because it's part of the target rather than because they understand why they're doing so. And some authors have questioned if you actually need to understand the principles of caries removal or cavity preparation at all in order to achieve a high score from a simulator. It's also, as has been mentioned already tonight, it's very different to the feedback that a tutor would give to a student, and very different to what they'll receive elsewhere in the course. A tutor might say to a student that the base of their cavity is too rough or they've got insufficient undercut. They wouldn't really be likely to look at the preparation and say, you need to remove 4% more, or you've removed 12% too much. So it lacks that sort of familiarity and sort of face validity that that they will get from the tutor's feedback. And it also runs the risk of punishing desirable behavior. So, for example, a rough cavity base at the limits of a target can actually be given a higher score than after it's been smoothed out, because some of that material that was needed to be removed to remove the unevenness was outside the target area. So that's not a great lesson to reinforce. And this makes it hard for the student to use that score to drive improvement, because the score as just a percentage can actually mislead them as to their real world performance, and in itself isn't really providing any insight on what they need to do to improve. So does this kind of feedback actually teach dentistry, or is it just facilitating the improvement of a steady hand through the ability to recreate a predefined shape? And if so, what could we do differently? James.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. So as Ashley's been explaining, we're trying to move away from exercises which might just actually improve somebody's dexterity and familiarity with the instruments. And in the same way that painting a picture by numbers doesn't really teach you how to paint. It's the very similar situation here in dentistry. So what we decided to do was to put together an exercise that in its design was very, very simple. In fact, it's just a straight line. But if we think about how we teach preoperative clinical skills in the Phantom Head Lab, this is one of the very simple exercises that we begin with. And the kind of core skills that we're looking to teach and to reinforce are linked to posture, they're linked to a finger rest, they're linked to planning the preparation, entry and exit points. And they're looking to maximize features such as undercut or a smooth floor or angle of approach. And so what looks like a simple straight line is actually fundamentally very complicated in terms of teaching component skills. So as you can see there on the pictures, we use some of these to explain the concepts to the students. But actually, by giving them these exercises and allowing them to do it unsupervised, or by giving them quantitative feedback, it's actually missing out on a very, very rich educational opportunity before we can move forwards. And actually, if we don't get these things right in the beginning, then we find students carrying out more complex tasks where the cognitive load is just too much. And we might spend lots of hours with them in the skills laboratory or in the simulator, but because we haven't established the fundamental core skills first, it's inefficient. And as Ashley suggested, we can actually reinforce a lot of negative skills. So as you can see there on the bottom of the screen, we wanted the exercise to be able to critique, or the simulator to be able to critique the exercise across a number of clinically relevant criteria. So on the clinics or in the Phantom Head Lab, we would probably ask the students whether they've been accurate in their preparation. So have they followed the prescribed outline? We'd probably make sure that they understood whether they were at a consistent and appropriate depth. And the instruction here is to prepare the line with maximum undercut at the full depth of the burr. We'd also want to know whether that was a relatively smooth and flat preparation, and also whether the depth of that preparation was consistent across the full extent of the line. So that's the principle behind the exercise. And if we move on now, who's going to talk next about what we did? I think actually it's the demonstration, isn't it, James?
That looks it. Thank you, James.
Good.
Ashley, Jonathan, thank you very much. So what we're going to do, first of all, a little introduction to myself, and then we'll be streaming the video live from a simulator that I have here in the office in France, and we'll be showing you the exercise live. So let me get up my screen. I've had a look through the participants we've got, and it's a pleasure to know a lot of you that are joining us today, so thank you very much. And a lot of you we've not yet met, but we hope to have the pleasure to meet very soon. But these are the best type of projects for us because they combine the knowledge, know-how from leading universities like the University of Sheffield, the University of Cardiff, and the technical know-how of the development team we have here in France that works on haptics, which is a very specialized educational area. So here we've got the live simulator, and hopefully you can see the screen live as well. So you can see we now have a new category for core operative skills, and you can see the 3 different designs that we have here. And the one I'm going to be doing is the straight line exercise that James was just talking about. So if I do this wildly out, we're going to say that I'm doing it to show you the feedback, but we'll see how we get on. So here I can zoom in. I have a single burr that I can use. And then with the haptics, I just need to do a short calibration for my positioning. And that just involves touching the block, clicking the foot pedal, and then positioning myself correctly. So there we go. So now I'm going to try to sit the head of the burr inside the block and then move along. Oh. There we go. There we go. And then once I've finished the exercise, I can go ahead and finalize it in the top corner. I can also reset and do it a number of times if I wish. Then when I come out of the exercise, I get some self-assessment questions, which is a new model, along with the 3D model, the visualization of what I've done. So let's say I'm wildly overconfident in my abilities, and I believe I've done everything perfectly down to the T. So I can answer the self-assessment questions and then validate them in the bottom right. Now you can see, whilst I've been overly confident, the simulator has then given me the feedback that actually I've not met the criteria. And with the tooltips, I can go in and find out that more qualitative feedback as to what I should have done to get a good result. As I move on from the validated assessment, I then have some self-reflection. So then from there, I can go in to the depth control, for instance, and then I can give my reasoning. So my depth control requires improvement. And why is that? Well, it's because I didn't establish a stable finger rest. So as I went to seat the burr, my hand was moving around. So then all of this information goes back into Vertes, the assistant, and then provides the teacher with my thought process as I'm going along. So I can do that for as many topics as I like. I can go back to the self-assessment and review my model, review the questions. And then when I'm ready, I can finish the self-reflection and then head back to the main menu. And from there, if I wanted to, launch into Vertes, the assistant as well. There we go. So that's a very quick live demo. And I guess over to you, James.
Thank you, James. Whilst we're there, actually, is it possible to just go back into the section where you were looking at the reflective cards?
Yeah, of course.
How easy that is to go back into. What I just want to explain to people is that the feedback that's given during the reflective exercise has been very carefully written to mirror the feedback, the specific feedback that we would give as clinical teachers. So you may have seen that whilst James was preparing it, but the cards were flipping relatively quickly. But one of the things that is very much missing from simulation, even if the simulators did give you accurate feedback about your preparation, there aren't simulators around at the moment that can actually give you the advice that a tutor would give you. So what you can see as we go through this process here is that the simulator isn't just allowing someone to self-critique their performance and tell them whether they're right or not, but it's actually able to give them some advice about how they can progress. So as we move to the reflection cards, you can see, for example, say we go to following the outline. If I felt that my outline requires improvement, and James drags that card across, I might think it's because I didn't maintain control of the handpiece. And the suggestion, therefore, is that I have an appropriate hold of the handpiece, I have a good posture, and at some point it will also suggest that I have a good finger rest. And that's further down, you can see on the bottom right, because I didn't establish a stable finger rest. And this is suggesting that we should find one and we should practice it before we begin the exercise. So the whole system is geared up in any configuration to give the feedback that we would give as clinical tutors. And I just think it's really important that we highlight that bit before we go any further. Okay, also, James, just whilst we're here, I know we're going to do questions at the end, but Sheila, one of our participants, is asking if you can just tilt your camera a bit to see, in terms of the simulator itself, what you're doing. So I think it's important to show that you have an actual handpiece down there rather than a mouse. So I don't know if we can actually see that in some way. But under here, we have a finger rest model, which has been 3D printed to mimic the potential finger rest positions in the mouth. And then we have an actual handpiece, and I'm not sure James will be able to show you that very easily, but it essentially replicates a high-speed handpiece exactly. So you can hold it in exactly the same way, and you can orientate it in exactly the same way that you could with a handpiece. And that gives you resistance in the 3 planes of movement to feel resistance as you're working through the tissues. So I hope that answers your question, Sheila. Good. Okay. Okay, she says she can't see it very well, but thank you. That's okay. It is quite small under there. Right, so if we go back to the next stage.
Right, thank you, Jim.
I think, Johnny, you're going to pick this up, aren't you?
Yes, I am, yeah.
Yep.
So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the research methodology behind the way that we validated the assessment process that we've just demonstrated to you. And this took us quite a while to get our heads around and really think how we could achieve this. So that we're going to describe the process of how we confirmed that the simulator was assessing what we wanted it to assess, essentially. So validity can be termed as the extent to which an assessment instrument measures what it is designed to measure. And there are a number of different forms of validity, and this can be assessed through objective and subjective means. But the form of validity that we were interested in was concurrent validity. And this essentially compares the assessment instrument, in our situation, the VR dental simulator, to an externally validated measure of the same performance. And for that, we used our dental tutors, our teachers at the University of Sheffield. Next slide, please. So the way we carried this out was that we performed a number of attempts of this exercise that we just demonstrated to you in order to demonstrate a range of good and bad performances based on the identified assessment criteria that James described. And these were the ability to be accurate in the preparation, so following the outline, whether the preparations were in appropriate depth, whether they had sufficient undercut, if the floor of the preparation was flat, and if the preparation was smooth enough. Next slide, please. So we carried these out on the VR dental simulator, and as you can see, we demonstrated a range of performances, both good and bad, some fulfilling all of the 5 criteria, and a variance of errors within the other forms of exercise that we did. And once we carried these out, we recorded the simulator responses to each of the 5 assessment criteria that we had. And then we subsequently exported the exercise and 3D printed the exercise in the same dimensions. And they were printed into these gray resin blocks, as you can see on the image on the right-hand side of the slide. Next slide, please. We then asked our clinical teachers that teach the preoperative skills courses to assess the preparations using the exact same criteria as the VR simulator had used. And the clinical teachers were equipped with the same instruments that they would use on clinics or within the clinical skills learning environment. And this was essentially a straight probe, but we also gave them a transparent template so that could demonstrate the ideal preparation outline. And again, they were given a form and were asked to assess these preparations using their probe regarding the accuracy of the preparation, the depth, the undercut, the flatness of the floor, and whether the preparation was smooth. And the answers for this was simply a yes or no. As clinical teachers, we need to make judgments on preparations and whether they are sufficient or not. On to the next slide, please. So we gathered both the VR dental simulator assessment responses and also the assessment responses from the clinical teachers. And we essentially looked at comparing them. But first of all, we measured the inter-rater reliability between all of the clinical teachers that assessed the preparations. And this was measured using a free marginal multilateral kappa. And then to validate the VR simulator assessment, both the pooled and modal clinical teacher responses were compared to the VR simulator assessment. And we compared these assessments through percentage agreements. Next slide, please. And this is a snapshot of the table that is included in the paper. But as you can see, we had very high agreement between the clinical teachers who assessed the preparations and the simulator that assessed the preparations within the simulator itself. And we noticed when we did this that and it's highlighted further in the paper, that there were a few aspects of the preparation that both the clinical teachers themselves didn't agree with, but also the simulator had more challenges in agreeing. And these were really related to the undercut. And as we know anecdotally as being educators, sometimes assessing the amount of undercut is probably more challenging than looking at the accuracy of a preparation or the depth. So there's some further research that needs to be undertaken to really dive deeper down into how we can assess the undercut better as clinical teachers. Because currently, as we saw in this research project, the simulator is actually more successful in assessing this than most of the clinical teachers that were used in the research project. Next slide, please. A further detail of the methodology and the results from all the different types of statistics that we did are included in the paper that was published in the European Journal of Dental Education in July 2020. And there's a link on the slide, but we can also circulate it around in the chat. And finally, where do we see this going from here? So this is simply one exercise, and we've validated the assessment that the simulator can provide. But now we need to look at more complex exercises and then eventually map this and carry this on to a real tooth in the VR simulator. So this is the next stage of the project. And also we need to look at developing and keep improving the reflective toolkit that we have to ensure that it maps to all of the vast different exercises and the skills that we teach in dentistry. I think that's my part done.
Okay. Thanks, Johnny. That's great. I'm going to task James Markey with trying to find a way that we can show Sheila possibly the handpiece a bit better whilst I'm talking about the next bit. So there's a challenge for you, James, whilst just to throw down that live gauntlet. Okay, just towards the end here, before we invite people to submit questions. In fact, you can be doing that straight away to the Q&A panel. Feel free to send some through. I want to use this opportunity as well to launch officially a new resource which we have online through ADEE, which is called the DigiDent project. And you can find this, it's live now. If you went to the ADEE.org website, the menu system on the right-hand side, if you clicked on projects, it would take you to the DigiDent homepage. And the DigiDent project was actually established before COVID, but it just fell in a very timely fashion. And what we wanted to do was to provide guidance for educators, well, across the globe really, but essentially within ADEE is mainly within Europe. But we wanted to provide guidance for how educators can better use digital tools in education. And this was probably more shaped by challenges that came along with COVID towards the later stages. But that was actually a very timely coincidental incident. So the DigiDent project draws together 5 different domains of advice, as you can see here. And actually, if we can go to the website itself and have a little look around, I'll just show people what we have. So this is the landing page, the home page here, with a little introduction. And you'll see there are lots of links on here, lots of blue hyperlinks to resources. It's very rich in terms of resources, and it tries to use a lot of resources from different institutions, different organizations, to help us as teachers to be informed and to use good techniques and technologies. So if we go to a domain, for example, like teaching, there are some resources there where it talks through how we can use digital education to deliver our teaching. If we click on the top tips, just for example, there, Ashley, that should bring up a little PDF, which is a quick reference guide for how we should put together digital education. We can just scroll down that, for example, and have a little look at some important principles, really, when putting education online. And some of these are not specific to dentistry. They are just general educational principles. But actually, they're all here as well to provide advice. So if we go back to the site, Ashley, and continue looking around, if we continue to scroll down that page, you'll see there's advice about designing digital curricula, about holding live interactive sessions, about synchronous and asynchronous material, about how to record and capture sessions, and how to create interactive live resources. and how to recognize digital learning achievements by students. And there's a lot on this page. This is just about learning, but we have the other domains below as well. If we go into another domain, for example, communication, there's advice here about how we communicate digitally with our students, general principles for that, and how we can actually use digital resources online to collaborate learning discussions, how we can use wikis or blogs, and how we can use portfolios as well. We try not to make it specific to a particular suite of applications, so there are links there to all of the different ranges of applications as well. And finally, I just want to draw your attention to the DigiDent library, which is a growing library of case studies of good practice. And you can filter this library based on, as you can see there, the type of teaching or assessment, communication or support, or data and portfolios, or even the platforms used, or you can search by keywords. And at the moment, we've put a number of papers on which start to show digital good practice in terms of how to deliver this, and it's usually focused on dentistry, if not clinical education. But what I also like to draw your attention to, if we go back a page, is the area where you can submit a case study, because what we'd like educators to do, where you're using digital education in your institutions, and you think it's a reasonable practice that you want to share or disseminate more widely, we'd invite you to submit a case study form through the DigiDent website so that your techniques, your good practice can be published and shared on the DigiDent library, searchable and accessible by anybody who wanted to log in. And over time, we can build a very good library. You'll notice that it's submitted in much the same way that an abstract is for a paper. And we will be relatively robust in the way that we look at these. But if you're able to fill in all of those domains in a logical way and evidence your practice well, then there's no reason why we won't publish that online as a case study. So you can also leave comments to me when you're submitting that. And obviously you can feel free to just email me or have a chat if there's anything that you wanted to know about further to do with that. So please do go and have a look at the DigiDent resource. It's on there. We'd like some feedback if you have any, so feel free to give that too. And that will continue to grow over the months and years as we see things change. So thank you for bearing with me whilst we had that little interlude. James, have we managed to get anywhere with how we can look at the handpiece?
The gauntlet down, challenge accepted. So I've put the height of the simulator up to its top. So what we'll be able to do, I'll be able to give you another, if I share my screen, we can show the process again whilst people are coming through with any questions they might want to ask. And so I've set it to left-handed so you can see the camera, but I'm not actually left-handed. So you've got a custom dental handpiece on the end of a haptic device, which gives you the touch feedback. So when I touch the block, I can't actually push any further than the block. And if I need to, I can calibrate the position. So I touch the block, press the foot pedal, and now I can move my hand to that right position using the finger rest. And as I do it, I'll go in, do my line across. If I can use my left hand. Voila, you don't want any treatments from me using my left hand, that's for sure. But then we can go ahead and you'll see the process. And what's exciting about these type of projects as well is that there's modules that come from them. So like this, the self-assessment, the module is reusable. So we're actually extending it to all of the other exercises which exist. Obviously not the validated feedback, but the self-assessment aspect of it, as well as the self-reflection, I think requires improvement is a valid response.
Yeah.
And then when you finish, and then for students as well as teachers, they have access directly now to Verti's the assistant from the simulator. So they can actually review their evaluations and they can have the communication, the back and forth with the teachers as well. So for the student, it's an automatic login. They can then see their evaluation, the 3D view of it, and everything else.
Thanks, James. That's great. Really good. I've got a few questions here which I'm going to answer, and some of them I might pass on to the rest of the team. The first one that's popped up is from Samuel, and he says, how can we justify using VR simulation when, you know, it might seem like we're adding curriculum load or curriculum content into an already busy environment in terms of curriculum? And I think that's a very valid point. But I think what we have to remember is that often phantom head rooms are a physical resource. Access to them is relatively limited. And what we're realizing now is that we should have access longitudinally on programs to skills training rather than at very defined focal points. And this throws up a problem in the physical phantom labs because we don't actually have that degree of unlimited resource. So the point that Jonathan made earlier is very valid in that these simulators are useful, but they have to be designed well. And I think Ashley made this point at the very beginning. They have to be designed well into the curriculum and integrated rather than just being purchased and sitting there and even just being timetabled for use. They have to actually be built into the curriculum so that students are learning specific skills on them. And when they do that, you relieve the burden on your wet lab. And as we've seen already through the case studies that we've just presented, we can actually make huge efficiencies, not just in terms of resource, but also in terms of practice and confidence for the students before they're treating their patients. So I understand your point, Samuel, but really the argument is quite clear if you are clear about what you want to use them for. And I think that's important going forwards. I don't know if any of you guys want to add to that at all, Samuel's point.
No, I completely agree about the burden that we have in the facilities of the Phantom Head Lab, and they do relieve the burden that we have in Sheffield for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Johnny. Also, I think it was Sheila that asked about whether we were just operating on a flat block, and you're right for this exercise. It's a very simple exercise. Of course, the larger suite of exercises on the Vertisi simulators do involve full jaws. They involve the full dental environment. There are implant modules for placing implants. It's quite extensive. But for the purposes of tonight, we're talking about a very simple, straightforward exercise, which is on a block. In the same way, when most people begin their skills courses in the wet lab, they begin with a relatively flat block that's not typical of a tooth surface. It's just to try and teach the core skills. So, you know, James is just demonstrating here some of the more advanced modules that the Vertisi simulator allows people to do. And as you can see down there, we also have endodontic, prosthodontic and implant modules as well. So it's very comprehensive. Also, just correct me if I'm wrong, James, but the implantology module isn't just about placing implants in the simulator. It's the full mock-up of planning. So you're merging essentially CBCT data with essentially what software like Simplant does to guide your implant placement. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the stage of the simulation where you're actually there drilling, but you've got the step before that where you're planning the implant as well. And what's interesting is it's not just you create the planning and you go into the simulation, but the students can actually go ahead and create their own planning, choose their positioning, choose the implant they want to use, for instance. And then when they're done, they get a comparison between what they've done and what their teacher's done.
Yeah.
And then, like I say, it's the blend between a real patient scan that's been used. So a real patient scan's been used to create the exercise, but then you even have the possibility of a virtual patient whilst you're in there as well.
Very good. Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Christian has asked a very, very pertinent question, and he says, if the digital simulator can outperform evaluation of staff, how can departments manage anxiety that would be associated with teachers' fear of being replaced by a machine, which is very true. But I think we do have to make the point here that what we're claiming is that The simulators are more consistent and more reliable, but that's only in their feedback. What they can't do is schedule a live session, talk to students in terms of all the hidden curriculum, correct their posture, put them at ease, all the things that the faculty and staff do around a session. What we're saying here is that instead of having a particular ratio of staff to students in a wet lab, that actually we can afford to make more use of our staff in a simulation suite. So we do, and Johnny made this point earlier, we do still need faculty and staff there, but the ratios can be stretched further because the simulators are able to provide more feedback than you would ordinarily get. You'd have to have just many more staff in the room to give the same kind of feedback. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that at all.
No, I think
Sheila's just made that point as well
in
on
the
the
comments.
Go on, Johnny.
Yeah, no, I think Sheila's absolutely right in the comments that it's just a tool, and it might be more reproducible at measuring a certain depth of a cavity, but it certainly doesn't replace the whole tutor as a whole in terms of demonstrating the procedure, providing knowledge, and so on. So yeah, it's absolutely a tool, and that's it.
Yeah, and if it can also be a discussion starter. So the simulator says one thing, and the student might have a perspective on that kind of feedback where the simulator said it's not good enough. They think it is. The tutor can then be there to explore any misconceptions that have led the student to into that position.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. And we've also got questions about ratios, which is very, it's understandable considering when people are putting business cases together for purchasing simulators, you know, part of that business case is going to be efficiency savings. It's going to be about ratios. And we know across Europe that typical skills lab ratio can range from 1 tutor to 4 students to 1 tutor to over 20, or sometimes, depending on the session, even 50. We have some data to show that in some countries across Europe, that ratio is very high. I think the point to make with simulators is that it's not that they should replicate the ratios that we expect with tutors, but actually it depends on the session that you're running. So you have to design the session. And again, Johnny and Ashley made this point earlier, you have to write it properly, like a lesson plan, like you would for a wet skills lab. And until you do that and you know what the expected outcomes are and what the exercises are and your time frame, you can't really just reliably say what your ratio should be. But I think it's probably fair to say that, for example, the straight line exercise we've just looked at, Johnny's ratio in Sheffield is probably maybe 1 to 8. Is that right, Johnny?
Yes. Yeah, 1 to 8.
Yeah. And how does that work?
And it works well. That's similar to the ratio that we use in Sheffield in our Phantom Head lab as well. And it's just the right amount, I feel. Yeah, so we do, but I think it's particularly important, the point that James made about planning the lesson really well. I think it's particularly important with virtual reality dental simulators that you need to plan the sessions well, plan the exercises that you're going to start with, and this avoids the kind of gaming experience, and it takes away maybe some of the features of the simulator that students can, perhaps because they're not using real teeth. Perhaps students can sometimes feel that it's more of a relaxed and a gaming type session, but it's really important to plan the session appropriately with clear educational aims, so you can really get the most out of the sessions.
Thanks, Johnny. And just in responding to Sheila's, sorry, Ashley.
No, I was just going to add to what Johnny was saying. One of the reasons why we started off with 8 simulators was because it's the same ratios as what we have in the Phantom labs. And for timetabling, it just made sense because you could take one group out of the Phantom lab and put them in the simulator lab and just rotate groups around quite simply.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and I think that you know, Sheila's point on the chat here is, do you have a simulator for each student or do you rotate them through? And I think that kind of answers that question. And I know, you know, James might put his fingers in his ear here, but there's little point in just buying a whole huge suite of simulators. Now, some schools have done that. And I think they'd be the first to say that it probably wasn't the wisest decision. You can have a large number of simulators, you know, and that if you've got the funding to do that, that's a very good thing to do. But just simply buying a simulator per student, I don't think is a very good use of of funding or physical resource, and it doesn't really send an appropriate message either to the students, because as Johnny's just said, and Ashley, this should be programmed learning. And in the same way, we wouldn't really expect that faculties which allow unlimited access to students, some schools have simulators in a room which has, for example, 24-hour access, like a computer cluster, and students can come and go and do the exercises as they wish. And as a team, we don't necessarily feel that that's a good approach either, because it devalues the principle of sitting at a simulator, in the same way that we wouldn't necessarily open our wet skills lab 24/7 and allow, even if there wasn't a resource implication in terms of cost or safety, we just wouldn't do that, because we actually want focused exercises with focused outcomes. And we want students to be efficient in what they do, not just rote learning to manage a system or a computer. So I'm just checking whether we've got any other questions or queries. There's probably the last few minutes if anybody wants to submit them. There's another one just popped in here. Here's one for James. Give advice for the first purchase of a digital simulator. Which brand and what is the cost? I guess you're biased, James, but do you want to talk to us about potential cost, actually?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's not a lot of choice at this, I guess, at this sort of mature stage of the market for the brands which are available, but all their costs tend to be around 45 to 65,000 euros per simulator, depending on the brand, depending on what you're looking for. But that gives you a ballpark figure to at least start the discussions with. But like I say, I am probably a little bit biased on which brand you should be choosing. But hopefully today you saw some of the functionality that you might not have heard about with Vertizi Dental, with the classroom setup, the communication between teachers and students, and now the very excellent exercises that we've been very fortunate to work in collaboration with you guys on.
And just to add as well, aside from the features which James has just mentioned, is just to reiterate the point about collaboration. And one of the reasons that we're here today with HRV Vertizi is because of the very open nature in which they work. We were able to come in, explain our rationale for wanting to develop things, and that development was supported. And that's sometimes quite difficult with other companies. Once you're sold simulators, sometimes we speak to colleagues who've bought other systems and they feel quite tied in with little opportunity for development. So I'm also biased. I've used various systems in various institutions, but we are here today with HRV. But we're advocating that system tonight, and I don't think we need to say much more in that regard. Okay, so I think we've answered all the questions. So it's been an absolute pleasure to host you all tonight. I'd like to say a huge thanks to James Markey, Pierre-Jean, Ashley and Jonathan. I'd also like to say a huge thanks to Dennis Murphy behind the scenes and Miguel, who you can't see, but they've been making sure everything works well in the background. So this will be available to watch again on the web, and we'll probably send out some emails with some links to that. So thank you very much, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.